The morning Constance Brierly stood in the doorway of the Vasquez Fellowship Hall and held the community's survival in her worn, paint-stained hands. The room was so quiet you could hear the cicadas grieving outside in the dead grass. 43 families sat in folding chairs that August, their faces the color of old wax, watching her. The banker from the Regional Development Consortium stood off to the side in a pale linen suit, his smile patient as a man-trap. He had driven 90 miles in an air-conditioned car to be there, which told you something about what he thought he was about to receive. The single ceiling fan overhead made one slow revolution and then another, pushing the hot air from one side of the room to the other without improving it. Constance set her mason jar of sweet tea on the table and looked at the people who had spent the better part of 2 years calling her, in tones ranging from pity to amusement, a woman adrift. She did not smile. She did not look at the banker. What she said and what she did in the next 20 minutes would be discussed at dinner tables in that valley for the next 40 years. But the real verdict, as anyone who knew the land would tell you, had been delivered long before that August morning in the patient, unhurried language of old walls and older knowledge. It had been delivered the way the land always delivers its judgments, quietly, to whoever was willing to listen. She had come to the valley 22 months earlier in the last week of October when the pecans were dropping and the light lay flat and golden across the limestone hills. She had driven herself in a 12-year-old truck loaded with what remained of a life after a long marriage and the particular financial devastation that follows a long illness paid for out of savings. Her name meant nothing here, which suited her fine. She was 72 years old, recently widowed, and possessed of a calm that some people, on first meeting, mistook for vacancy. She was not vacant. She had simply learned, in the way that certain people learn things only after losing nearly everything, to hold herself very still and pay attention. The house she had inherited from a second cousin twice removed was called, locally, the Mast property, and its reputation preceded it the way a smell precedes its source. 12 acres of thin caliche soil on the wrong side of a limestone ridge. The house itself, a 2-room clapboard structure that had been vacant for 9 years and had during that vacancy developed opinions of its own about what was structural and what was merely aspirational. The roof sagged at one corner like a dog-eared page. The porch boards spoke when you walked on them, not in protest, but in something closer to surprised gratitude that anyone had come at all. The realtor who drove Constance out on the day she was to take possession was a young man with a practiced sympathy in his voice, and he said more than once that she ought to think very carefully before putting any money into a property with these particular characteristics. He used the phrase "these particular characteristics" the way a polite person uses a euphemism for something they cannot bring themselves to name directly. She thanked him for his concern. She paid him his commission on a property whose sale price was nearly nothing, because the estate had debts that needed satisfying, and the difference between the property's value and those debts was $1,700 in her favor, once everything was settled. $1,700 and 12 acres of caliche, and a house that had been thinking things over for 9 years. She stood on the saggy porch as the realtor drove back toward the highway, and she listened to the dry country around her, and what she felt was not despair. What she felt was the particular silence of a thing that has been waiting. She had her truck, her tools, her knowledge of how to work, and a mind that her husband had once described as a piano that never went out of tune. She spent the first 2 weeks patching the worst of the roof, reseating the porch boards, and doing the arithmetic of survival in a small wire-bound notebook she carried in her breast pocket. The arithmetic was not encouraging. She had $4,200 in a checking account after the estate was closed. She had the truck, worth perhaps $1,800 if she found a generous buyer. She had no pension, a Social Security check that arrived monthly, and covered her groceries and her fuel and her medications with approximately $40 remaining. She had 12 acres of thin soil and a house with approximately 9 years' worth of opinions. On her third day on the property, she walked the 12 acres slowly, the way you walk when you are trying to hear rather than see. The ridge to the north threw a long shadow in the morning. The soil along the base of that ridge was a different color than the rest, darker, with a clay content that held moisture longer than the exposed caliche further south. She noted this in the wire notebook without knowing yet what it meant. On the eastern boundary, nearly hidden by a thicket of cedar elm that had grown up unchallenged for a decade, she found the remains of what had once been a structure, maybe 12 by 20 feet, its concrete pad still intact, its walls long since collapsed and hauled away for salvage. She noted this, too. She walked the perimeter twice, pausing at the northeast corner, where a faint depression in the ground ran in a slightly irregular line for perhaps 30 feet, before losing itself in the elm thicket. She crouched down and put her hand flat on the soil. It was marginally cooler than the surrounding ground. She did not know why. She wrote a question mark in the notebook. She had brought with her 2 cardboard boxes of books, most of them practical, because in the last 18 months of her husband's illness, she had read everything she could find about the question of what a 70-something woman with limited capital and rural land could do to sustain herself. She had read about kitchen gardens and fruit trees and beekeeping and small-scale fiber production. None of those felt like the answer, though she could not yet have said why. What she kept returning to in the evenings after she had swept out the house and laid her sleeping bag on the floor because she had not yet acquired a bed was a short library of books about natural building, about lime plaster and adobe, about the thermal mass of old walls and the way certain traditional building methods stored and released heat with an intelligence that modern construction, for all its insulation ratings and vapor barriers, never quite replicated. The house had 14-inch walls. She had assumed at first that this simply meant a great deal of old wood framing and batting insulation. But on a warm afternoon in her second week, when she was pulling loose a section of interior wall board that had buckled from an old water leak, she found behind it not insulation, but earth. Compacted, dense, the color of dark river clay shot through with pale fiber, built up in layers she could count the way you count a tree's rings. The fiber was straw. The walls of the massed property were not wood frame. They had been built, sometime before the First World War, using a technique that used the earth itself as the building material, the straw as the binding, and the lime plaster on both interior and exterior faces as the skin. The walls held heat in winter and released it slowly through summer days, keeping the interior 7 to 10 degrees cooler than the ambient air through the worst of a Texas afternoon, without any mechanical assistance whatsoever. She stood with a chunk of the wall material in her hand and turned it over and read it the way you read something that answers a question you had not known you were asking. She wrote in the notebook, "The house already knows what it is doing. It has been waiting for someone to ask it." That was the first thing. The second thing came 3 weeks later on a Sunday morning in November, when a battered pickup even older than her own turned off the county road and came down her track without being invited. The man who climbed out was very old, perhaps 85, with a face like a landscape, weathered into its final permanent expression of mild, ironic patience. He introduced himself as Ivo Szymanski, said he farmed the 40 acres to the north and east of her ridge, said he had farmed it for 49 years, and said he had come to say hello because a neighbor was a neighbor, whatever anybody else might think of the land she had. He sat on her porch step, since there were no chairs, and drank the coffee she made him in a dented pot on the camp stove, and he looked at the property with the long, calm gaze of a man who has been looking at the same general piece of country for half a century. He said in the soft, accented cadence that had come with him from Poland in 1962 and never entirely left, that there was a saying where he grew up. He said it in Polish first and then translated it. "What the earth holds it returns with interest, but only to the one who does not hurry it. He looked at the question mark in her notebook when she showed him the line about the depression in the soil near the northeast corner, and he nodded and said he thought he knew what that was. He told her that the previous owner of the property, old Teodoro Vasquez himself, had capped a spring somewhere along that ridge boundary sometime in the 1940s when the Regional Water Authority had mapped and registered all surface water sources, because Teodoro had not wanted the complication of a registered spring on his deed. He had capped it with flagstone and covered it with earth, and planted the elm thicket over it and simply not mentioned it, and over the decades nobody had mentioned it either, and it had passed out of living memory along with Teodoro, who had died in 1987 without descendants to remember or be curious. She sat very still when Ivo told her this. She was thinking about the dark clay soil along the base of the ridge. She was thinking about the slightly cooler ground along the irregular depression. She was thinking about what a registered, flowing spring on 12 acres of caliche land in a drought-stressed region of central Texas was worth in simple, practical terms, to say nothing of what it meant for the question of what could grow on the dark clay strip and what the property might do that it had not yet been asked to do. She did not say any of this to Ivo. She said she appreciated him coming, and she asked about his soil, and they talked for 2 more hours about the specific character of the limestone country, and about what grew well in the shade of a ridge, and what withered, and about the particular variety of small, hard onion that grew wild along spring margins in this part of the county and tasted of nothing else on earth. And when he left, she walked to the northeast corner and crouched down and put both hands flat on the ground, and the ground was cold and faintly damp, and she could feel, or believe she could feel, the slow, patient throb of water moving somewhere below the flagstone. What the earth holds, she wrote in the notebook, it returns with interest. She spent the month of December working alone, which meant the cold was her companion, and the creaking of the old earth walls was her conversation. She used a contractor's bar and a good deal of careful patience to locate the flagstone cap 3 feet below the surface, exactly where the depression pointed. She cleared the elm roots from around it over the course of a week, working mornings while the light was useful, stopping when her back told her to stop, a negotiation she had learned was not optional at 72. The flagstone, when she finally levered it clear, revealed a seep, not a gushing spring, but a steady, unhurried emergence of cold, clear water from a fractured limestone shelf, filling a natural basin in the rock at a rate she measured with a bucket and a watch as approximately 40 gallons per hour. 40 gallons per hour, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. She did the arithmetic in the notebook. 350,400 gallons per year, from a source that had been registered to nobody and capped over and forgotten and waiting in the dark under a flagstone and a decade's worth of elm roots. She covered it again carefully with a temporary wooden cap to keep it clean. She told nobody. She sat with this knowledge the way you sit with a coal you have found burning in the ashes after you thought the fire was out, covering it gently, keeping it low, giving it air only enough to hold. She understood that what she had found was not yet a resource, because a resource requires a purpose, and the purpose would take time to arrive and would need to be the right one. The Valley's relationship with Constance Brierly during that winter and into the spring was one of cheerful, amiable dismissal. She became a fixture of the minor social cartography of Drysdale Crossing, the way certain harmless anomalies become fixtures, filed away under Old Mass Place widow, noted without curiosity, smiled at without unkindness, and without real interest. At the feed store she was Connie. At the post office she was Mrs. Brierly. At the only sit-down diner in Drysdale Crossing where she went on Friday mornings because the breakfast was $4.50 and the coffee was good, she was that woman who bought the Massed Place, said in the tone used for a punchline whose joke has already been told. She heard it, and she let it sit in the air, and she drank her coffee. In April, a man came to the diner wearing the dust of a long drive and asked the counter if anyone knew the area's limestone country well enough to consult on a rehabilitation project. He was from San Antonio, an architect named Garza, who was working with a preservation nonprofit on a series of traditional earthen structures in the region, and he had heard there was vernacular, rammed earth construction somewhere in the county, and he wanted to see it. The diner referred him to Constance, mostly as a joke, and Constance drove him to the massed property and showed him the walls. He ran his hand along the exposed section she had opened up, and he stood back and looked at the proportions of the structure, and he was quiet for a long while. Then he said that this was one of the best preserved examples of traditional stabilized rammed earth construction he had seen in private residential use in the state of Texas, that the lime-rendered exterior had protected the earthen core to a degree that was frankly exceptional, and that his organization's preservation fund had a budget for exactly this kind of documentation and potentially for a material study. He asked if she would consent to be involved. He said his project budget for the Drysdale Crossing documentation phase was $8,000, and that a portion of that could be structured as a property access fee, that being the mechanism the nonprofit used when the structure was on private land. She said yes. She said it in one word, quietly, in the way she said most things. She had learned in 2 decades of accounting work for a small furniture manufacturer that the person who needs the transaction rarely benefits from appearing to need it. The $8,000 went into a separate envelope in the freezer, which is where she kept money she intended to leave alone. She resumed her arithmetic. She had been thinking through the winter and into the spring about what the spring and the dark clay strip and the rammed earth house were collectively pointing toward, and she had arrived at an answer that would have, if she had said it aloud in the Drysdale Crossing diner, produced the kind of laughter that a very good joke produces, which is to say, laughter with a long echo. She was going to grow lime basil and specialty culinary herbs irrigated by the spring in the microclimate created by the ridge shadow, and she was going to dry and package them in the naturally climate-controlled environment of the rammed earth house, which maintained a temperature differential of 8 to 12 degrees Celsius from the ambient heat through the worst of the summer. And she was going to sell them to restaurants in Austin and San Antonio, and the spring water, clear and cold, and with a mineral profile that she had sent off to an agricultural extension lab and been told was unusually clean and calcium-rich, would be the irrigation source, and also, if certain things went the way she thought they might, a resource in its own right. She planted in May on the dark clay strip 22 raised beds constructed from salvaged cedar posts and filled with a mix of the native clay and compost she had been building from the elm debris and kitchen waste since December. She ran irrigation from the spring in half-inch polyethylene tubing, gravity-fed from a small collection tank she built from a salvaged galvanized stock tank set on a 6-inch rock platform to create head pressure. The total materials cost for the irrigation setup was $412. The total materials cost for the raised beds was $280 of salvaged lumber and $80 of mesh and hardware. She was a woman who knew the difference between money spent and money invested, and she knew which this was. The boy arrived in June. He was 10 years old, the youngest of the Rocha family that farmed a small operation 3 properties over, and his name was Gabriel, but he did not volunteer this immediately. He simply appeared one morning standing at the edge of the raised beds, watching her transplant seedlings in the way that certain children watch things, with the total absorption of someone who finds the work more interesting than whoever is performing it. She did not shoo him. She handed him a flat of basil seedlings and showed him the spacing, and he worked alongside her for 2 hours without being asked and without speaking. And when she gave him a glass of water from the spring, he drank it and said, with the frankness of 10-year-olds, "That tastes like somewhere." She told him the water came from the rock. He considered this and found it acceptable. He came back the next morning and the morning after that, and within a week his presence was simply a fact of the operation, like the morning shadow of the ridge and the particular smell of basil in the heat. He named the raised beds. Bed 1 he called the General because it produced the most. Bed 7 he called the Worrier because it wilted most readily in the afternoon heat, requiring an extra irrigation, and he developed a proprietary concern for it. He was not a talkative child. He noticed things. When the irrigation tube developed a slow seep at a joint fitting, he fixed it without being told, using a length of electrical tape from his pocket with the practicality of a child who has always known that the tools you carry are the tools you will have. Constance worked alongside this silent boy through the early summer mornings and felt something loosening in her chest that had been tight for 3 years, which is to say, since the diagnosis, which is to say, since the world had contracted to the dimensions of a hospital room and a parking garage and a bank statement. By August, the first harvest was ready. She drove to Austin with 12 pounds of dried specialty basil, 8 pounds of dried lemon thyme, and 4 pounds of a variety she had labeled Ridge Shadow Oregano, for no better reason than that it had naturalized itself along the clay strip without being planted and produced a compound leaf structure and a flavor profile that the Extension Lab, when she had sent them a sample, had described as having an unusual secondary terpene concentration attributable, they suspected, to the calcium-rich spring water and the particular mineral content of the clay. She had no customers. She drove to the back doors of restaurants and knocked and asked. At the 4th restaurant, a small Italian place on the east side, a chef named Marie Claude came out, took 1 leaf of the Ridge Shadow Oregano, put it in her mouth, and stood still for a moment. Then she said, in a voice with the flat declarative authority of someone who does not make many mistakes about food, "Where has this been?" She bought all 4 pounds at $38 per pound. She placed a standing order for everything Constance could produce of the Ridge Shadow Oregano at $30 per pound, saying she was discounting 5% for volume commitment. And she handed her a card and said she would give the name to 3 other chefs she knew and that they would call. Constance drove back to Drysdale Crossing on the highway with the windows down and did not turn the radio on. She was doing the arithmetic in her head with the specific pleasure of arithmetic that comes out in your favor for the first time. She wrote in the notebook that evening, "Today, the first return. The earth held it. The earth returned it. With interest. The drought came in the 2nd October as the forecasters had been predicting, and the old-timers had been feeling in their knees for 18 months. It came the way Ivo had once described the droughts of his memory, not as the absence of rain, but as the presence of a pressure, a weight, the sky lowering itself onto the land and staying. The creek that ran through the valley floor went to a series of disconnected pools in November. In December, those pools went to damp spots in the gravel. By January, 11 of the valley's 23 active agricultural operations were drawing on reserve tanks and watching the reserve tanks fall. By February, the reserve tanks were being trucked in. Constance's beds were green. The spring gave it steady 40 gallons an hour without modification, without anxiety, without any apparent awareness of the crisis being performed in the country around it. She covered the beds in December with row covers cut from salvaged frost cloth and weighted with river stone, and beneath the frost cloth the Ridge Shadow, oregano, and the basil and the thyme continued their slow, patient cold season production. The rammed earth house held 63 degrees Fahrenheit through the coldest nights without any heat source other than its own stored thermal mass, which she supplemented with a small wood stove burning the cedar elm she had been clearing from the spring margin. The valley noticed. It was not possible for the valley not to notice eventually that the massed place was green when everything else was the color of old bone. They noticed the way communities notice things they have been wrong about, which is slowly and with a reluctance that is inversely proportional to how confident they were in being wrong. She had been in quiet, steady contact with the Austin and San Antonio restaurant network all through the drought winter, filling orders, expanding into 2 additional herb varieties, and she had begun in January to answer cautious inquiries from 3 other Valley Farm operations who wanted to understand how her irrigation was functioning. She answered truthfully in general terms, without disclosing the spring, because the spring was not yet registered, and she needed, before she disclosed it, to understand what the registration process would entail and what her rights were. She had spent $250 on a consultation with a water rights attorney in December, which she regarded as the most efficient $250 she had spent in 2 years, because what the attorney told her was that a spring of this yield on private land, if registered proactively under the Regional Groundwater District's small producer exemption, could be allocated for agricultural use on the property and for a limited commercial sale of the water as a raw agricultural input to neighboring operations. At a rate set by her up to a threshold volume the attorney specified precisely. Above that threshold she would need a different classification, but below it she was, for all practical purposes, in possession of a legal, registered, allocable water resource, at a time when water was the single most expensive and scarcest input in the region. She registered the spring in the first week of February quietly by mail. She told Evo, because Evo had given her the knowledge that led her there, and she told Gabriel, because Gabriel had been working the beds through the worst of the winter mornings in a coat that was not warm enough and had never once complained or asked for compensation, and she gave him a sum of money she had set aside for this purpose, 3 months of wages at the hourly rate, the county agricultural extension listed as fair market for farm labor, and she handed it to him in an envelope, and said it was pay for work done and nothing else. He counted it with the seriousness of a 10-year-old boy who has not handled that much money before, and put it in his coat pocket, and went back to checking the irrigation lines without saying more than thank you, which was all that needed to be said. The banker arrived in March. His name was Ellery Croft. He represented a consortium called Rio Piedra Agricultural Development, and he drove a white Suburban that was recently detailed and smelled when he climbed out of it, of something with citrus and cedar in it that did not come from any tree that grew in this county. He was not unpleasant. He was the kind of man who is never unpleasant in the way that a baited trap is never unpleasant. He had a card that listed 4 titles under his name and a handshake calibrated to communicate that he was taking her seriously without committing to doing so in any binding way. He said Rio Piedra was assembling a regional water resource management initiative and that her property, given its position on the ridge and its unusual soil characteristics, had come to their attention. He said the consortium was prepared to offer her a fair and generous price for the property in total, including all surface and subsurface rights, and he named a number. The number was $240,000. She thanked him and said she was not interested in selling. He said the offer was time-sensitive and represented the strongest price her property was likely to command in current market conditions given the general depression in regional land values created by the drought. He said a woman in her position, alone, with limited income and rising operational costs, might find the liquidity beneficial. She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "I find the property more beneficial." He left his card. She set it on the porch railing where the wind took it in 3 days. He came back in April, this time with a second card, a different set of numbers, and a mention, which he delivered with the casualness of someone who has rehearsed casualness of certain provisions in the Regional Groundwater District's commercial allocation rules that could, in certain circumstances, complicate a small producer's registration if the district board determined that the allocation was inconsistent with regional management goals. He said this in a tone of concern. She recognized it as the tone of a man reading from a script he wrote himself. She thanked him again and declined again, and this time she wrote down the exact words he used about the groundwater district provisions because she had learned as an accountant that the precise phrasing of a veiled threat is itself a document. In May, something happened in the community that told her Croft was not operating alone and was not operating carelessly. She went to the diner on a Friday morning, and two of the people she had nodded at for 18 months did not nod back. One of the farmers whose acreage she had been quietly supplying with the spring water under a simple agricultural water contract told her he had received a visit from a man who said her registration was under challenge. It was not under challenge. She checked with the water rights attorney, who confirmed there was no pending challenge, and billed her $60 for the confirmation, which she paid without irritation. In June, a county commissioner's court notice appeared in the local paper, and the notice referenced a petition from a regional agricultural development consortium requesting that the commissioners consider a resolution calling for a review of small producer water allocations in the drought emergency zone. The notice listed the area of the proposed review with coordinates that, when she drew them on her property survey, enclosed her 12 acres exactly and nothing else. She kept the notice. She kept the attorney's letter. She kept her transcript of Croft's April conversation. She covered the spring collection point with a new concrete cap she poured herself from a bag of ready-mix and river aggregate, and she set an ordinary rock on top of the concrete that did not look like anything in particular, and she went back to filling orders. The communal meeting was called for August by the Valley's informal agricultural cooperative, because by then 17 of the 23 operations were in acute crisis, and the cooperative's board had decided that a collective conversation about regional water resources was necessary before the fall planting decisions, which for many operations had already been functionally decided by the simple absence of water to support them. The meeting was at the Vasquez Fellowship Hall, which was what it had been called since Teodoro Vasquez's family donated the building to the county in 1988, the year after Teodoro died. Constance had been asked to attend by the cooperative board in a brief, careful note that said only that she had resources and knowledge relevant to the group's situation. Ellery Croft was there, uninvited in any official capacity, standing near the side wall in his pale linen suit. He had arrived before anyone else, which meant he had been watching for the notice or had known about it through someone on the board. She noted this with the flat attention she brought to all information. 43 families were represented in the folding chairs. The cooperative board chairperson, a woman named Pilar Fuentes, opened the meeting with a description of the crisis that was spare and factual, because the facts were spare and factual, and Pilar was not a person who dressed them. 17 operations in significant distress, 11 with no reliable water source for spring planting, 4 facing debt service they could not meet if spring planting failed, 3 facing the realistic prospect of forced sale if the drought extended another season, which the long-range forecast said it would. Croft spoke after Pilar. He spoke with the warmth of a man distributing charity, which is a specific warmth that contains within it, if you have learned to listen for it, a chill. He said Rio Piedra was prepared to offer emergency water infrastructure development across the valley in exchange for certain long-term surface and subsurface rights agreements, and that for the 11 operations facing debt service pressure, the consortium could structure a purchase-leaseback arrangement that would allow families to remain on their land while the consortium managed the water resource. He showed a slide on a portable projector that described this arrangement in language of such polished generosity that 3 people in the room began to cry, which was the effect the language was designed to produce. Constance waited until he had finished. Then she stood up. She said she wanted to ask a question. She said Croft had mentioned, in the course of his April visit to her property, that her spring water registration might face a complication from the Groundwater District Board. She said she wanted to understand how he had known the volume and allocation rate of her registration at that point, since that information was in a district filing that had been submitted by mail and was not yet publicly accessible. She had confirmed with the district clerk that no third party had requested access to the file during the 30-day period after submission. The district operated on a standard administrative lag, and the public access window had opened only in late March, several weeks before Croft's April visit. Yet the file had received no recorded third-party requests during that period, which meant that on the day of his visit, the allocation figure was not yet in the public record. She paused and let that sit in the room the way a stone sits after you have placed it down carefully and without hurry. She said the number he had mentioned in April, 351,000 gallons per year, was the number in her private filing, and it was not a round number, and it was not a number anyone arrived at by approximation. It was a measured number derived from a timed bucket test. She would like to understand, she said, how that number appeared in his vocabulary in April. The room was very quiet. The ceiling fan turned. Croft said nothing that resolved the question. What he said was more words arranged around the absence of an answer, which is a technique that works in negotiation and fails catastrophically in a room full of farming families who are losing their water and their land, and who have just been shown in one piece of arithmetic that the man offering to help them has been inside a private document he had no legal access to. Constance sat down. She did not say anything else about Croft. She did not need to, because the room had done the arithmetic itself, and 43 families are faster than one man when the calculation is simple. She waited while the room resolved. Pilar asked Croft to clarify. He declined in language that was still warm and still polished, but the warmth had gone hollow, the way a struck drum goes hollow, and everyone in the room could hear the hollow quality. Constance watched 3 people who had been nodding at him now look at their hands. She watched a man named Harlan Dodd, who farmed the largest single operation in the valley and who had been Croft's most likely conversion, turn in his chair and look at her with an expression that carried in it the weight of a man recalibrating. Harlan had been one of the voices 18 months earlier who had told the diner that the old widow at the Mass place was throwing good money after bad on ground that would not support a lemon drop. He had said this with the authority of a man who had farmed this valley for 30 years. He had not been malicious. He had been wrong, and he had now just watched her dismantle, in 4 sentences and 1 piece of arithmetic, a consortium that had been moving toward his land for the better part of a year. Croft left without a formal departure. He gathered his portable projector and his card holder, and he walked out the side door while Pilar was still speaking, and nobody stopped him or called after him, which was its own kind of verdict. What Constance said to the room after Croft was gone was direct and simple, and she said it in the plain, unhurried voice she used for everything. She said her spring was registered to her property, and it would remain registered to her property. And she had been providing water under individual contracts to 4 valley operations since February, and intended to extend that to any operation that needed it at a rate she named, which was the rate that covered her costs for maintaining the collection infrastructure, and nothing above that, structured as a payment for infrastructure maintenance rather than for the water itself, because the water came from the rock and she had not made it and did not feel it was hers to sell at a profit. She said this as though it were obvious, which to her it was. She said she could supply approximately 11 operations through the planting season on the spring's current yield, prioritizing the operations with the highest debt service pressure, and that she was prepared to begin delivery the following week. She said she wanted nothing for this except the thing she had been earning for 2 years in this valley, which was to be allowed to farm her 12 acres and be a neighbor. There was no applause. There was something better than applause, which was the sound of 43 people exhaling at once. And in that exhalation, all the architecture of contempt and amusement and dismissal and pity that had structured the community's relationship with the woman at the mast place came apart quietly, the way a building made of the wrong material comes apart when the weather it was never designed for finally arrives. Harlan Dodd was the first to stand. He was a large man, and his hat was in his hands when he stood, which for Harlan was the equivalent of a formal ceremony. He said he owed her an apology and a thank you, and he was not sure which came first. She told him the apology was not necessary, and the thank you was not necessary, but she appreciated them both, which made him laugh in a way that broke something in the room open. And after that people were talking, and the folding chairs were moving, and Pilar was already at the whiteboard sketching the delivery logistics. Ivo came to see her 3 days after the meeting. He was walking slowly with a cane he had acquired since the winter, but he was walking. He sat on the porch, which now had chairs because Gabriel's father had built her a bench and 2 Adirondack chairs from salvaged cedar in February as payment, he said, for the use of the spring irrigation that had kept their kitchen garden alive through the drought. Ivo sat in one of the Adirondack chairs and drank the good coffee she made and looked out at the beds, which were green and orderly in the early morning, the ridge shadow throwing its long, cool diagonal across the clay strip, the spring running in its polyethylene tube without complaint. He said the aphorism differently this time, as the Polish original, and then he said it in English again, slowly, not as a lesson, but as a recognition of something that had already happened and needed only to be named. What the earth holds, it returns with interest, but only to the one who does not hurry it. He set his cup down and looked at the beds and the house with its rendered earth walls and its saggy porch, that was no longer saggy because she had replaced 3 joists in the spring, and he said, she listened, that is all. She just listened. The rains came in September. They came the way rains come after a long drought, tentatively at first, a few drops on the dust that made small dark stars, and then fully, as though embarrassed by their own hesitation, filling the creek in 2 days and the stock ponds in a week, and the sky turning from white to a gray that was welcome as anything gray had ever been. Constance stood on the porch in the rain without a coat, and let it come down on her, and looked at her 12 acres drinking, and she thought about the wire notebook and the question mark she had written at the northeast corner, and the coal she had found in the ash, and the arithmetic that had run from $1,700 and a collapsing porch to something she did not yet have a word for, but which the valley had given her the shape of in an August room with 43 families and a ceiling fan. She went inside and took the notebook from her breast pocket. It was wet, but intact, which was appropriate for something that had spent 2 years in the breast pocket of a woman doing outdoor work in Central Texas. She opened it to the last written page. She wrote the date. She wrote the amount she had on account, which was not a large fortune, but was a sum that a woman who had arrived with $1,700 and 12 acres of caliche and a house full of opinions could look at without apology. She wrote below it, in the margin where she had always made her notes, the house knew, the water knew, I only asked. She set the notebook down and listened to the rain on the rammed earth walls, and the rammed earth walls listened back, holding the sound the way they held everything, in their patient, unhurried, ancient way. Outside in bed 7, the one Gabriel called the Worrier, the oregano was drinking the rain with the uncomplicated gratitude of a thing that has been, from the beginning, exactly where it was supposed to be. The ridge stood where it had stood for 1,000,000 years, and threw its shadow, and would throw it tomorrow and the day after, cooling the dark clay strip, holding the moisture, keeping its long, quiet counsel on what was possible and what was not, and what had simply been waiting for someone to stop talking long enough to hear it. She had come to this valley a woman adrift. That was the phrase they had used, with the gentle, dismissive certainty of people who are sure they understand what they see. She had come adrift, and she had put down roots in the only way that roots are ever put down, which is slowly and in the dark and without any announcement. And now the valley had grown around those roots without entirely realizing it was doing so, and the phrase, when she heard it now in her memory, meant something so different from what it had meant when they said it that it might as well have been in another language. What the earth holds, it returns with interest. She had not hurried it. She had listened, that was all. That was everything.
C'est pour toi que tu vas avoir du mal à t'en mettre, mais je vais devoir y aller. Oui, papy, y a pas de souci. Bon courage. Boulot, fermeture de la semaine. Ah, putain. Ouais, non, mais... J'ai envie de pleurer. Non, mais même en payant, je peux payer 45 balles, là, pour... Non, 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 non. Qu'est-ce qu'il me dit, lui? Ah non, là, on récupère rien. Ah, faut se faire une raison, faut se faire une raison. Là, je l'aurai jamais. Bah, je vais croiser les doigts. Je vais croiser les doigts pour qu'il soit mis dans la nouvelle. Vous voulez, là, que de bon matin, je retente ça? Vraiment? C'était où, d'ailleurs? C'était là? Pas du tout. Pas du tout. C'était dans quoi? Non, là. Et bonjour, David. Bonjour, bonjour. Comment tu vas? Allez. Allez, je retente mes deux bons matins, comme ça, pas réveillé, faire un combat. Ça va être tendu. Hein. On y va? Allez. Oui, mais comme disait Papy hier, je pense que dans tous les cas, il reviendra. Il peut pas... Ah oui, esquive dès le départ. Ils peuvent pas... Oh, putain, tu parles d'une esquive dès le départ, j'ai même pas toute ma santé. Allez, on se concentre, on se concentre, on se concentre, on se concentre.